because I'm a historian, in 20 years to see how historians evaluate Putin's role as a leader of Russia. And I think it's going to be a big debate, the pluses and the minuses, and I don't know how it's going to come out. And that would be an interesting debate to have here today. But let me address your attention to what the elephant in the room we haven't mentioned. All this embracing of Russia in the 1990s, all this wonderful things we did for them, but weren't we also expanding NATO toward their borders? And you say, so what? Okay, so I come over, I find out where you live, and I park all my military equipment across the street. And I say, I'm just here for your security. I'm making sure nobody breaks in your house. And then I notice that you brought a few other folks along, and they've got all their military equipment in my backyard too. And then you're suddenly in my soft underbelly in the South in Georgia. But don't worry, this is for your security. And by the way, NATO is about democracy, and you need democracy. All right, let's be serious. We were warned and warned and warned by the Russians we liked in Russia, the liberals even, and Gary knows this, were worried about this, and came to Washington and said, you're pushing too far. Eventually, wait a minute, don't use up my time, eventually, rightly or wrongly, but perception is everything in politics, the Russian political elite decided that this expansion of NATO was a way of making sure Russia would forever be a subservient state to the West. And that the brass ring, well, the silver ring was Georgia, and there was a proxy war there because of this in 2008, but the brass ring was always been Ukraine. It's spoken openly in Washington. Now, be honest, if you think this is a good policy, if you believe we should push our power as close to Russia as we can, bring Ukraine into the Western security system because it's good for us, then say so. And then let's debate that issue. But let's don't go on about the demon Putin and the rest, because the reality is that the Russian understanding of what Ukraine is about is what NATO expansion has been about from the beginning, and that the Ukrainian crisis arose because, rightly or wrongly, the Russian political class believed that NATO was on its way not only to Kiev, but to Crimea. Now, we can say it's crazy, but perception is politics, is everything. And you want to be safe in this world, you isolate Russia, they're going to perceive us in an even more extreme form, and we will never be safe.
Okay, let's go to Ann on this rebuttal on NATO.
I'll say it as you invited me, Mr. Cohen, it's crazy. First of all, number one, why did NATO expansion happen? Let's tick back the clock again to the 1990s. Who did it come from? Who wanted it? It was the Central Europeans who wanted it, who asked for it. Initially, it was not an American idea. It was a Central European idea, and I remember because I was in Warsaw when that happened and when it first came up. Why did the Central Europeans wanted it? They wanted it because they were afraid. They were afraid of Russia even then. They saw what Russia was becoming. Very reluctantly, the United States agreed to expand a security zone so that 100 million people would be able to make a transition to democracy, begin economic development and growth without fear of invasion. And it worked. It was unbelievably successful.
It worked?
It worked for the Central Europeans. Yes. 100 million people were safe. You know, a region that had been the source of 2 world wars has not been a source of conflict since then. How did we do it? It was carried out in a manner designed to reassure Russia from the beginning. Russia was included in every piece of negotiation. No NATO bases were ever placed in the new member states. Until 2013, no exercises were ever conducted in the new member states. In response to Russian objections, and this is a very important point, both Ukraine and Georgia were openly and definitively denied NATO membership in 2008, and that has been repeated ever since, and it is not on the table now. What are you looking at me like that?
In 2008, it was stated by the...
In 2008,
there
was a NATO meeting, and they said there will be no membership plan for Ukraine and Georgia. It isn't happening. And since then, it hasn't been on the table, and it's not an issue.
Well, they said something else in 2008. They said something else at that meeting in 2008.
We seem to remember a different event.
No, I don't remember it differently. I read it the other night. Well, you won't let me finish the sentence, so how can I tell you? They said, however, NATO membership remains open to Georgia and Ukraine if they qualify.
And it remains open to Russia as well.
You said theoretically?
It remains open to Russia as well.
Please.
The point is...
Okay, Vladimir, come in on this. I know this is something you feel strongly about.
No, it was turned down. Wait, and I haven't finished with my last point. And what's been happening since then? In this long period of time, while Russia was rebuilding its military, while it was invading one neighbor after another, the American army was drawing down its European forces, so much so that by 2013, there was not one single American tank in Europe. This is an aggressive policy. There is no way that Putin believed in a genuine military threat from NATO. This is something that he has been using at home as a way to consolidate his power.
Okay, let's go to Vladimir. I'm going to Vladimir for here. I'll come to you.
The NATO discussion in no way consolidates his power at home. In no way. As far as the people are concerned, it has nothing to do with his power. But NATO does have to do with the Russian psyche. And perception, as was said, is very important. Let me remind you about what happened in 1962. 1962.
62. Well, I wasn't born yet.
Were you around? Well, if you weren't, in 1962, two independent countries, one called the Soviet Union, the other called Cuba, agreed to have Soviet missiles placed on Cuban soil. Reason being, there were American missiles in Turkey. And so the Soviets decided it's a good idea to have our missiles closer to the United States. This was the height of the Cold War. Two countries have the right to make that kind of decision. When the United States found out that this was happening, it said, no, you will not do this. And if we have to sink your ships, we will sink them. And if as a result World War III happens, it will happen. These are facts.
Yeah,
and so the Soviets,
sorry, Mr. Posner,
Soviets turned around.
One of the things that the U.S. negotiated with, that NATO, no, you can't finish.
I can. Well, thank you very much. And that's the way they speak to Russia.
Okay.
Exactly. It's not okay.
NATO negotiated with Russia.
It is not okay.
With Russia an agreement not to move nuclear missiles.
And that's not the way you debate. Unless maybe it is. I don't know.
That's how you become man of the year in Ukraine.
So I will repeat, that did not happen.
Now, Yanukovych is
rightly or wrongly, the way Russia looks at NATO, it sees it as a threat. Why was NATO created? To protect the West, Western Europe, from a possible Soviet invasion. There is no more Soviet Union, has not been one for over 25 years. The Warsaw Pact, which was kind of the Soviets' answer to NATO, is no longer there. Mikhail Gorbachev, who I tend to trust, told me 3 times that James Baker, who was then Secretary of State, told him, if you agree to the unification of Germany and taking down the Berlin Wall, I tell you that NATO will not move 1 inch to the east. Now, you may say he's lying, but I don't think he is. I think he's telling the truth. And the thing is that during the Soviet period, which didn't last very long after that, NATO did not move to the east. It moved under Clinton. And when the Russians started saying, what's going on here? I mean Yeltsin. He was told, no, we have no agreement with you. We had an agreement with the Soviet Union, but it's no longer there. You're Russia. And so in 1991, Poland, Czechoslovakia, which is still Czechoslovakia, became members of NATO. And then it was followed later on. Yes, it was.
In 1991.
Yeah.
You'll find it was later.
In 1999, it was followed by Romania.
98 and 2002.
No. Well, look, let's not. The argument isn't about dates, it's about
tweets. Please,
All right. I may have gotten the date mistaken, but nonetheless,
it matters, and I'm going to explain to you why. Yeah.
Finally, NATO found itself on Russia's border, in Estonia and in Latvia. This is Russia's border. Now, again, you may say, but there's nothing dangerous about that. I'm telling you, this is perhaps the result of Cold War mentality. But NATO is seen as a threat. And what the Russians have said about Ukraine, rightly or wrongly, is we will not allow NATO to be on our border in the Southwest. Will not allow. As America did not allow the missiles, we will not allow this. You can condone it, not condone it. That is the reaction. That's the way it's seen. You perhaps think that NATO is not dangerous. Fine.
Let me, okay, this is the couple of points, and one is just, I heard about Russian elite, Mr. Cohen repeatedly said it. There's no Russian elite making decisions. There's one man who makes all the decisions. And by the way, this Russian elite, as a combined entity, knows exactly where to put their kids, their money, their fortunes, South Kensington, London, all the way from Riga to the west and to Miami, so probably in this country as well. Yeah, so that's why, the whole idea of the Russian elite, being afraid of the West, not true. Because they know that they can be saved, with their fortunes and the future generations here. And then another myth, of course, which I hear repeatedly. Putin is very popular. And whoever, Levada Center, I don't want to argue with you about the integrity. Yes, I agree, I give them full credit. Now, what is an opinion poll? Somebody calls you anonymously and asks, what do you think about Mr. Putin? That's an opinion poll. No. Now, I'm really proud for my country that there are 20% of people who say they don't like Putin to a potentially KGB agent who's calling them. Yeah. And also, what I hear, we're being accused of being, a Cold War warriors, warmongering crazies. But we want to live in the 21st century. What we hear is the 19th or 20th century. I hear America, Russia, Russia, America, sometimes maybe Germany. What about countries in between? There are some countries, and I believe these people have the same rights.
I agree.
I was in Kyiv not 2 years ago, but 2 weeks ago.
So?
And I proudly met these young Ukrainians who stood against the corrupt regime of Viktor Yanukovych that was in power 2 years ago. And I believe it's their right to decide what will happen with their country. The support for NATO membership in Ukraine 18 months ago was, I don't know, merely 16 or 17%. It's quadrupled. Guess why? And it's not just, Russian-Ukrainian war there. I spoke to people who fought in the Eastern Front. Who could have imagined that there will be front east of Kyiv? Most of them are ethnic Russians. Russians from Kharkov, from the Dnipropetrovsk. They are fighting Putin's invading armies because they don't want to live in Putin's Russia. This is the Russia I want to see.
Good. Okay, Stephen and then Ann.
But it's Putin again.
Yeah.
Are we going to have a discussion of what's in the best interest of the West? Because that really is embedded in the question, isn't it? Should we engage or isolate Russia? Or should we have a debate about how we're going to get rid of Putin? If you want to have that debate, then for the next month, you can bring in the 2 points of view. Ms. Applebaum wrote a wonderful book of history called Gulag. And I strongly recommend that if you have an interest in it, you read it, because a master historian's at work there. And as she knows, now comes the however. I understand that for one reason or another, she views this whole saga of NATO expansion through the perspective of Central and Eastern Europe. I understand that. But the story she told of NATO expansion is nowhere written in the histories we now have that have resorted to the archives, that have looked at the Clinton administration, looked at other things. There was tremendous pressure in the United States on Clinton to go back on the word that had been given to Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't expand. We know the story The archive recently in Foreign Affairs, a young woman produced as part of her dissertation an examination of those archives. So the whole history of NATO expansion, I mean, that's the kind of fairy tale version, that we did it to protect them from Russia, which was already menacing them when Russia was broken down in the 90s, and we had to save them, and we brought democracy along the way. But it isn't the true story. The reality is, there's another debate to be had here, and I just drop it, and some of you won't even like the question. Does a nation, any nation, have the right to join NATO if it technically qualifies for NATO membership? It's always said that's so. I disagree. NATO is a security organization. It's not the Junior Chamber of Commerce. I don't know if you have that in Canada. It's not a non-selective sorority or fraternity. You get in if we like you. It's a security organization, and the only criterion in the end that matters is, does it enhance our security or not? And NATO has brought the greatest crisis in international affairs since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And a lot of people are rethinking this. And by the way, some of those countries to which Ms. Applebaum is so devoted are also rethinking it. Read what the Czech president says. Read what's being said in Hungary. Read what's being said in the other half of Poland. There are a lot of fundamental questions about whether or not this really enhanced the security of Europe. That's a debate. Yes. But you don't get a debate with opinion, you get it with facts, and these are the facts.
His election campaign was paid by Lukoil. Zeman's election campaign paid by Lukoil. Yeah, and he was defied by his own parliament. Yeah. Openly, by the way, and his own government. Zeman, President of Czech Republic.
I just want to be conscious of our time for this segment of the debate and end with the topic that I think is on a lot of people's minds, and you and I spoke about this earlier, so I want you to answer it. It's the presence of nuclear weapons in this conversation and the large nuclear arsenal that Russia has. And I'm sure many people would naturally feel a tendency to come over to the accommodation, the compromise camp on the basis that we just can't get this wrong. We can't risk the potential for an escalation that could flow from a policy of isolation, a more assertive stance towards Russia. How do you respond to that?
I respond. First, I wanted to. Mr. Posner didn't let me correct him, but in fact, one of the other elements of NATO expansion that was very important was an agreement not to move nuclear missiles, an agreement which the West has kept to.
Yes,
so that's one. You know, this is why the Cuban Missile Crisis analogy is completely wrong. And,
it's not wrong at all. It's fear.
And has nothing to do with it.
It's fear on both sides.
Okay. Fear there is. So. What is the answer to the question about nuclear weapons? Fear of nuclear weapons is very central to this issue. It actually explains why we aren't more enthusiastic about helping Ukraine. If Ukraine were being invaded by Belarus, yeah, we might give them some radar weapons and not worried about it. Why don't we help Ukraine? Because we're afraid of Russia's nuclear arsenal. And we are afraid also, as one of my opponents said, we are afraid that this is an irrational country. It might sell nuclear weapons to other people, one of you said. We don't know what it might do. It might run off the ranch and do something crazy. What is the way in the past in which we've dealt with a country like that? It's called deterrence. Deterrence is not an aggressive policy. It is not an offensive policy. It is defense. The deterrence argument is, if you bomb us, we will bomb you back. It's very unattractive as a policy, and no one likes it. It's mutually assured destruction, Dr. Strangelove. It's a horrible thought. But given that this is the only policy we have that we know that works, and the only policy that we are capable of using now towards Putin's Russia, which does not want to be engaged with us anymore, which pumps out propaganda against us in all kinds of different ways, in all kinds of countries, whether it's, as you say, funding the Czech president's election, whether it's funding the far right in France. This is a country that doesn't want to be part of our system anymore and has made that very clear. What can we do? We can deter. We can make sure that Putin knows, that the Russian regime knows, and it is Putin and the word cronies, by the way, is an important one. Because what are they? They're just rich guys who are his friends, but somehow they're very powerful. What other word do we have to describe them? What we need is to make sure that that group of people knows that we would respond. That's the only thing we can do now. We don't have a better policy than that, and I'm very sorry. And in some ways, it's one of the great tragedies of my life. I've watched all this happen. I wrote a history of the Soviet Union. I watched the transition happen, and now we're back to exactly the place I would never have wanted us to be.
Not the place. I think we're in a much worse place than we were, quite frankly. Because back then, there were two ideologies
No, there are two
facing
ideologies
each other. Now there's no ideology in Russia.
Oh, yes,
there's
there
no
is.
ideology.
There
and
is.
for most people, there isn't. They don't even know what is the future? What's the promise? What are we working for? Back in those days, whether it was true or not, it's a different
good
issue.
old days.
But for our children, those were terrible days. But there was an ideology, and it was from the start. And the Red Scare was about ideology, and you know it as well as I do. In this particular case, it's no longer ideology. It's geopolitics. It's whose interests.
So why does this put us in a more dangerous position vis-a-vis nuclear weapons?
Predictable. Because it's less predictable. And another thing has happened which is really interesting. Back in the bad old days, there was real fear of nuclear weapons. Yeah. Children hiding under desks, movies like The Day After. People were aware. Today, people aren't even talking about nuclear weapons.
Except in Poland.
It's as if they weren't there, but they are.
Oh, they're talking about it.
So I think it's very dangerous. They're not talking anywhere. And I look into this very carefully. They're not present the way they used to be.
Okay,
and I think that's a bad thing.
I'm going to go to Gary on this point, and then I'm going to give you, Stephen, the last word.
I wish nobody would talk about nuclear weapons, but Russian television for last year have been talking about it, and threatening the West. What about the big billboards about turning America in the radioactive ash? Vladimir Putin publicly.
One person saying that. Come on.
That's Channel 2 Russian television.
It's like
yes, one person says 100 million watching.
It's like Khrushchev.
And Vladimir Putin publicly said he would use nukes if the West would stand against him in Crimea. He already said it.
He did not. He did not.
No, he said.
Look, let's be
truthful.
It
was a documentary,
he did not. He did not say he would use nukes.
He said on high alert.
Pardon me?
He said they talked about going on high alert.
That's correct.
And the United States has been on
but
high alert.
But there is a difference. Come on. You can do. Let's be a little bit more precise here. He did not say that. Khrushchev said, "We'll bury you." Remember that?
Yes.
And
I read in the books.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
and I heard Putin. That's a difference.
So when some idiot says turn to nuclear, no, it wasn't he who said about ash. You know who said that?
But he keeps talking about it.
It was not
he keeps talking about Russian nuclear arsenal as the argument.
And it was on television, and the guy who said it was Dmitry Kiselyov, and we heard him say it. So it's not Putin. If you talk about reality, you listen to a Rush Limbaugh on American television or something like that, and you say, look what the Americans are saying. This is a jerk, you'll excuse me, saying what he's saying.
But I can have jokes of all stripes on American television.
It's not a Russian policy.
And there's only one color in Russia.
And it's not an American policy. It's separate people. And let's make that very clear.
Let's give...
Kiselyov, unlike American anchorman, is on the payroll of Kremlin. That's the difference.
Stephen, let's give you the final say on this important point of how the threat of nuclear weapons flows into the discussion of isolation versus engagement.
Nuclear weapons. Yes. I will take the rabbinical view here that both Kasparov and Posner are right. Talk of nuclear weapons has reemerged. Not in the same way that we were conscious of them but the discussion has reemerged. Ms. Applebaum wrote a column recently. I don't think she put the head on it, but it was the ethos of the column, which essentially said we should rattle our nuclear weapons. And when people start talking like that, and she echoed that column here today, I think we know we're in dangerous territory. I would go even farther in alarm than Posner, and I would say we are in a new Cold War, by whatever name, and it's potentially more dangerous than the last one. This is where the nuclear weapons come in, for several reasons. Because the epicenter of the last Cold War was in Berlin. This one is in Ukraine, right on Russia's borders. So imagine the possibilities for provocation, mistakes, and all the rest. Secondly, and this really worries me, during the last Cold War, 40 years, the great powers developed a series of rules of conduct. Hot phones, hotlines, constant discussion, meetings that kept us safe. This is a fact. I mean, this happened over 40 years. There are no rules of conduct yet in this new Cold War, and that's why anything can happen. A third reason is there's no opposition to it in the United States, and there was a lot of opposition before. But you will remember that one of the great achievements of Reagan and Gorbachev was to eliminate, and the only time a category of nuclear weapons had been eliminated, ever, intermediate cruise range missiles. I think it was 1987, if I'm not mistaken. That was an enormous achievement. It made everybody safer. Those missiles don't leave but 4 or 5 minutes for alert systems to perceive whether it's a seagull or a missile coming in. And there are a lot of recorded misperceptions on these radar systems. Now both sides, not one side, both sides are talking about reintroducing intermediate range missiles. The Russians are talking about putting them in Crimea and Kaliningrad. I think Gary would agree with that. They've said that, talked about it. And the United States is talking about putting them back in Western Europe. That's how dangerous it is. Because my two opponents really hate Putin? You want to go there?
Okay. Well, we're going to go to closing statements. So let's have Gary Kasparov up first. Gary, you've got 3 minutes.
Yeah, I have to ask Mr. Cohen's forgiveness because I want to talk about Vladimir Putin again. It's yes, there was a difference in old, bad old days, as Mr. Posner said. There was a Politburo, and even if you have 10 worst people in the world, they can make more balanced decisions than one man. And now, again, for Vladimir Putin, there's no way out. I mean, he should present himself as a strong man who can protect Russia against endless enemies that besieged my country. And I said from the very beginning, so I'm a Russian patriot. I want to see my country free and strong, and to play a role, a positive role. I don't want to hear the same jokes as recently have been revived in Eastern Europe when, say, Putin entering the country, being asked by a custom officer, occupation, he says, yes, of course. This is not the image of Russia I want to project. And it's hard for me to argue for isolation, but this is not an isolation of Russia. This is isolation of a dictator. The strength of a dictator is like a mafia boss, a capo di tutti capi, the ringleader of the all-world thugs. And he keeps power not because he's elected, not because, he has some, birthrights, as a monarch, but because he protects everybody, because he's invincible, because nobody can go after him. And as long as he keeps this image of a strong man, he prevails. And every time the free world makes concession, he is getting more and more arrogant. If he's not stopped in Ukraine, he'll move further. He can start, provocations in Baltic countries to undermine NATO because he needs cows. He needs muddy waters. That's the way for him to survive politically. It's all about domestic politics because he has nothing else to offer. No more trump cards, but the foreign policy expansion. And talking about isolation, and again, we spoke a lot about the Cold War, and the name Henry Kissinger was mentioned. Yeah, I do remember. I was a kid, but I read the stories, and later I learned more about it. In 1974, there was a big debate in the US Senate about Jackson-Vanik. That was an amendment that put together the free trade with the Soviet Union and the human rights together. Bipartisan support. The administration and Mr. Kissinger spoke against it. And it was a great man. The man was my role model, Andrei Sakharov, who was under harassment, eventually ended up in exile, who spoke for, you may call it, isolation, because that was the way to weaken the regime. It's very important that we send this message, not to Putin, forget him now. It's about his cronies, or about inner circle, or Russian bureaucracy, or a middle class in Moscow. They should understand that policy of engagement that enhanced dictatorship in Russia will no longer be in place, and the free world will stand behind its values and will think not about Putin's Russia, but rather the future of my great country. Thank you.
Three minutes.
I was going to begin with a lighthearted remark that's saying it would really be fun just to see Kasparov and Posner go after each other alone. Actually, was in Moscow in early March, and I was in kitchens where Russians have this conversation, and representatives of both sides were there, so a big debate goes on in Russia. But when Kasparov said that he thought Sakharov was going to be on his side today, I suddenly felt, I wouldn't say angry, but really disappointed. Something should be sacred, and I think that's the name of Sakharov. Sakharov absolutely would not have supported the isolation of Russia, under no circumstances. His whole life, everything he wrote, no, Gary, the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb derived a lesson from that, and that was we must engage on these issues. You need to go back and read. Worshipping somebody without reading them is probably not the way to go. And the same thing about Putin. I haven't come here. I am not pro-Putin. I have no sentimental attachment to Putin whatsoever. He's a subject, as a historian to me, of study. But I think if you were to read what Putin actually says, read his speech when they annexed Crimea, read what he said, they have driven us in a corner and we have nowhere to retreat to. You say, what do you mean? How did we drive you into a corner? He's talking about NATO. He's talking about the encroachment on Ukraine. All right, you say, no, we're virtuous. But I come back to this issue. To isolate is to exacerbate those distorted perceptions of us, if you think they're distorted. So let me end by returning to an astonishing thing that Miss Applebaum said. She said, and I tried to write it, I don't do shorthand, Putin's Russia does not want to be part of our system any longer. I think she said that. That is, Russia wanted to be, but under Putin it no longer wants to be. It's a strange statement because, first of all, and I promise you this, and you can go to Kremlin.ru in English and read every major speech Putin has given. He is on his knees pleading to be part of the West and lamenting that he's been driven from the West. Don't put your hands up, Gary. Don't do it. I would not come here and lie to you. Read this last 6 or 7 large speeches on the Ukrainian crisis. Read them. But there's one other thing. Russia was never part of our system. I said facts, not opinions. The fact is, and Ms. Applebaum omitted this with this fairy tale about nation expansion, that NATO expansion excluded Russia from the post-Soviet European system of security. Russia was excluded. How can they not want to be part of a system they were not made a part of?
Ladies and gentlemen, it's no doubt been a very confusing evening. You have just heard 2 radically different accounts of contemporary Russia. You have heard, on one side, Russia, it's a little bit difficult. I don't really want to support it. I'm not really pro-Putin. But it's the kind of state we need to speak to, we need to engage with, we need to talk to them. You know, it's very important that we are reasonable with them so that we can continue to divide up the world the way we once did 25 years ago. On our side, you've heard an argument that this is actually a different kind of nation. You know, this is a nation that thinks differently. This is a nation where the reason we keep talking about Putin and his cronies, and, you know, as I said, we're searching for a word, is because this is these are owner-occupiers. You know, these are not just politicians. They own Gazprom. The owners of Gazprom are the leaders of the country. They use their businesses, they use their media inside their country, inside Ukraine, inside Central Europe, and inside all over the West in order to achieve their own ends. And what are their ends? Their ends are to remain in power. Everything, whatever it is that Putin does, his ultimate goal is stay in power. Whether it's build up his nuclear arsenal, whether it's carry out military exercises, whether it's claiming that Malaysian planes were shot down by Martians, whatever it's going to be, the idea is always about maintaining his power. We're forced to talk about him because he's so dominant. What you haven't heard from any of us much tonight, and certainly not from our opponents, is much about the people who have been the most important victims of the West's policy of engagement until now. And these are the young and energized Ukrainians who stood on the Maidan in the cold last year in order to fight Putin-style corruption and dictatorship. These men and women have, in the past 18 months, created new television stations from scratch. They have run for parliament and won on anti-corruption tickets. They have set up organizations designed to promote transparency and good government. They may well not succeed. They have an extraordinary obstacles to overcome. They may well not succeed, but their goal is to create a more democratic, more fair, and less corrupt world in the 21st century, and Putin's Russia is trying to stop them. I repeat, Ukraine is not Putin's only target. He also wants to undermine our societies, corrupt our politicians, spread conspiracies inside our media. He hopes to persuade Europeans to succumb to the old temptations of the fascist far right. To stop this from happening, to stop him from destroying Ukraine, we need to isolate Russia in this sense, enforce our own corruption laws, disentangle ourselves from the drug of Russian money, and reestablish the Western solidarity which he's trying to destroy.
Mr. Posner, the last word.
Thank you. Thank you. I refuse to play this game of who's nice and who's not. I care about Russia. And I'm going to ask you, what are the consequences of isolating Russia? Well, as I count them, there's a minimum of 10. And all 10 are detrimental to the West. First, it plays into the hands of the chauvinist and anti-Western forces in Russia that dream of bringing down the Iron Curtain again. Second, it plays into the hands of the traditionally anti-Western Russian Orthodox Church. Third, it reinforces the feeling now shared by 73% of all Russians that the West, led by the United States, is the enemy. Fourth, it turns Russia eastward into a partnership with Communist China, a partnership that is both dangerous and threatening to the West. Fifth, it makes Russia ever more unpredictable. Sixth, it plays into the hands of Russia's military-industrial complex. 7, it reinforces the traditional Russian desire to circle the wagons in view of what seems as a hostile environment. 8, it minimizes any and all outside information for the Russian people who presently do have access to Western media, to Western movies, and to the internet. 9, it cuts off travel for all average citizens, including tourism, exchanges, educational opportunities. And 10, it leads to the birth of a generation of Russians hostile to the West. What are the consequences of engaging Russia? By engaging Russia, and by this I mean opening its doors to as many Russians as is physically possible, easing visa restrictions, or waiving them altogether, allowing Russians to visit, to work, to send their children to schools and universities, to develop human contacts. The West, by that, will achieve a profound change in people's mindset. This will fundamentally change the country, its politics and its policies. It will not happen overnight, but it will inevitably happen. And this, beyond a question of the doubt, will be a huge positive for the West. And by the same token, for Russia and for the Russian people. And finally, I'd like you to say that if, as Miss Applebaum once wrote in this magazine, the Russian president dreams of setting down a new Iron Curtain, this is her article, well then isolating Russia is playing right into Mr. Putin's hands. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've been treated to a superb hour-and-a-half debate. I want to thank, on behalf of the entire audience, our debaters tonight. Bravo. Great job. And again, a thank you to the Aurea Foundation for making this all possible. This is the type of informed conversation, regardless of what side of this issue you stand on, that I think we all benefit from. So thank you, Peter and Melanie, the Aurea Foundation, for making tonight possible. Bravo. So let's review where public opinion in this hall was at the beginning of tonight's debate when we asked you to vote on the resolution, agree, disagree on, be it resolved, the West should engage and not isolate Russia. Get that up now. I'll try to do it from memory. I think it was 43%.
53, I think, engage.
57-43.
There we are. 54% agree, 46% disagree. So very close. And then we asked how many of you would be open to changing your mind. We saw a big number there in terms of people's views being in play, 89%. So this debate is very much up for grabs now. All of you have a second ballot in your program. Please use that to vote on the way out of the hall. We're going to have the results for you in the reception a little bit after 9 p.m. And again, thank you all 3,000 of you, for turning out for tonight's debate. Let's go vote! I'm going to just do a hit for the online audience. So for those of you that have been watching online, thank you for being part of tonight's debate. We're going to have the results for you on Facebook and Twitter shortly after 9 o'clock. Just look for our handle at Munk Debate or our Facebook page. And again, you can keep using our polling application to vote up until 9 o'clock. Thanks for being part of the Munk Debates. We'll do it all again next fall. We appreciate you tuning in online. Good night. Take care.